From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 44.
Don't make such a fuss over a few dead humans.
The voice of Bass Greenbrier rang in his memory, followed by the image of children's legs sticking out of the smoking oven. Then Fraenk saw the black worms crawling across the elf's terrible smile. Another voice, this time the arch-partisan, was saying,
Bass Greenbrier had a head full of black worms.
And now here they were, spilling down the breastplate of Leos Muninger's armour. "No," Fraenk whispered. "Leos, no!" The big man seemed to regard him for a moment. His eyes were hollow pits of darkness. "Fraenk," Leos said, as if recognizing him for the first time. He grunted in pain and shook his head, making sweat fly from his slick hair. "Fraenk, there you are. I've been looking for you." The big man hauled the sword up over his head in an almost lazy motion and brought it crashing down. Sparks jumped where the blade glanced off the ground. Fraenk rolled to keep from getting chopped in half. "What are you doing? Stop this!" Fraenk shouted. Leos swung again, another overhand cut that sent more sparks up and rang in the air like the toll of a bell. The big man didn't seem to be trying too hard to kill him, but Fraenk had to move to stay out of the path of the blade. "Leos, you're sick. There's black worms inside your brain. They're controlling you." "Controlling me!" Muninger screamed and slashed the air with a series of slices that Fraenk never would have been able to avoid. He felt the rush of air on either side of his face. "They don't control me, Fraenk. They protect me. From you." Leos levelled the two-handed sword point right at his face. Fraenk crabbed backwards, then felt the shaft of the spear under one hand. He snatched it and brought the point up defensively. But Leos was walking away from him now. "I tried to make amends, tried to earn absolution. But there can be no forgiveness, can there, Fraenk? You'll never let go of the past, and I'll always be held in bondage to you." "You don't owe me anything. What's past is done," Fraenk said, standing. "Just stop this and we—" "Then do you forgive me?" The big man turned back suddenly. Fraenk hesitated too long before uttering an unconvincing yes. "A lie," Leos shot back. "You always lie. That's what you do. You live to manipulate and control." "I never," Fraenk started. "Tried to exploit me?" Leos Muninger howled and rubbed furiously at the side of his forehead. "They told me you just did. My little friends said you wanted to reach in and hurt my mind. But they stopped you. You can't reach me with the necklace when they are protecting me." "They're eating your mind, Leos," Fraenk said imploringly. "I've seen it already. They're going to destroy you. I know you can feel them in there."
Neversleep, kill him.
Olwyn Brightrock was standing unsteadily with one sword raised. His other arm was bleeding freely and hung loose at his side. Fraenk moved closer, keeping the spear point aimed at Leos's head. "Leos, we can get you to a healer. They can help you," Fraenk said, hoping he was right. Either way, he had to get his friend to lower the sword. "Give me the necklace, Fraenk," Leos said plainly. "Give it to me now, and I won't kill your friend." Whatever Leos thought was going to happen, Fraenk was certainly not going to let him hurt Olwyn Brightrock. If that meant stabbing Leos with the spear, he'd do it. Then a flare of light and an anguished sound came from Fraenk's right. He turned just in time to see the two wizards grappled together in some sort of arcane wrestling contest. Sorzon Brimblade had the arcane Lord Phylax by the neck with two glowing hands, and the man trying to pry the Hell-Touched's grip apart with his own magical counter. Blood was pouring from Phylax's neck and shoulders, and he was crying out in anguish. Then the spell on his hands flickered, briefly, and finally went out. The next instant, Brimblade pulled the man's head completely from his shoulders in a mess of bloody carnage. The arcane lord's body jerked, then tilted forward and hit the street. Frank's shock was only surpassed when he felt the spear suddenly jerk from his grip. When he looked, Leos had it now in hand. Without a pause, he hefted it up into an overhand grip and sent it sailing through the air. It hit Olwyn Brightrock in the abdomen, launching him backward and pinning his body against the wooden gate of one of the wealthy estates along the street. Brightrock gasped and dropped his sword, clutching at the spear lodged in his side. Fraenk roared in anguish. "That was your choice, Fraenk," Leos warned. He grabbed up his sword again, stalking toward the old elf. "The necklace, Fraenk, or I have your friend's head." Leos Muninger stood aside the elf with the blade in both hands, poised like an executioner ready to do his grim task. He let the point rest on the back of Brightrock's neck. Olwyn looked out with steely, resolute eyes. "Wait!" Fraenk stepped forward, raising his hand.
"Go, Neversleep.
Brightrock said, a fresh spatter of blood on his lips.
Get the mind thief out of here. Don't look back."
"I guess this one doesn't matter much to you either. A pity." Muninger raised the blade high over his head. "This is what Neversleep's acquaintance gains you." "Have it!" Fraenk shouted, stopping the big man before he could swing. Leos paused, then turned as Fraenk pulled off his glove and held out the in as Tylerborn. "You want it, it's yours. Here. Let no more lives be lost because of it." He loosed the necklace to dangle in his hand. Leos fixed upon it and his eyes went dull. It seemed to take the fight entirely out of him. His grip on the sword loosened, and he let the point drop to the ground. I can feel them crawling," Leos said in a small, scared voice. "Come on," Fraenk said, holding the necklace out. "This is what you came for." Leos took a step towards him. The two-handed blade fell from his grip and clattered to the ground. Good, Fraenk thought. This was working. Just draw him in. Leos started towards him in slow, plodding steps. He reached out. Fraenk balled his other fist, ready to drop his old friend as soon as he was in range. "Fraenk?" Leos's big hand scratched at the crown of his scalp. "Something's wrong with me." Fraenk kept the necklace held out. Its secondary magic was having some kind of dampening effect on the worms. He just needed to keep Leos looking at it until he could.
"I will take that."
A blood-covered glove snatched the necklace from Fraenk's grip. He turned to see Brimblade holding the Ineas Tylerborn, smiling in victorious savagery. Fraenk was just about to launch himself at Brimblade when the Hell-Touched held out his poisoned dagger and waved it as a warning.
"Careful, Fraenk. You have no one left to carry you off to the temple for healing."
The Hell-Touched warned.
"How did she do, by the way? Did the Exalt live? Did they have to saw her leg off to save her?"
With the mind thief no longer in his sight, Leos straightened, its effects losing all sway over him. He shot an irritated look at the Hell-Touched man. "There, in my head," Leos whimpered.
"You've served your purpose, fool. I will bring this to the Master. You finish up here, and then you may join us for the summoning. The sign of the Under One is upon us. The hour of cleansing is here."
Brimblade said, the green gem burning brightly on his neck. His voice sounded doubled, like two men speaking the same words. Brimblade then stepped back. Despite his clear exhaustion and battered appearance, the Hell-Touched gestured and uttered some arcane words that sent a swirling blue-green fire up from the ground that surrounded and engulfed him entirely. When the flames diminished, Brimblade was gone. Leos strode back to pick up his sword. He adjusted his hands on the grip and raised the blade. Fraenk looked around at the obliterated partisan guard detail. Brightrock had slumped against the wall, unable to collapse to the ground, pinned as he was. It was just Fraenk and Leos standing in the streets. "Leos, your mind is poisoned," Fraenk pleaded. "Dandrican said you'd try to trick me, Fraenk. He gave them to me to protect myself." "Dandrican? He gave you the worms?" "He cultivates them. In the plague house. The men there don't mind. They're dying," Leos said. Frank's brain was reeling. Questions and conclusions were crashing against each other like a frothing sea. Dandrican sent these two after the mind thief? He must have had some other plan for it. But what was he going to do? It had to be what Brimblade had been talking about. The Under One. Who was the Under One? The words of the bald street preacher sprang into Frank's mind. The cult leader of Nim's supposed Palewood Brethren was preaching something very similar to that. Was Dandrican trying to sell him the mind thief? Perhaps as a way to keep his novices in thrall. This plan seemed far more sinister than the charlatan preacher controlling a group of backwoods yokels, however. "Leos, what is Dandrican going to do with the necklace?" Fraenk demanded. "The Under One will cleanse the city of its sins," Leos recited. "What is the Under One?" Fraenk asked, knowing the answer was not good. "Bultzon, the great Leviathan. The gateway to the arcane realm will be opened, and they shall call it forth. The Nether Demon shall drown the city in blood and fire." "Nether Demon?" Fraenk stammered. "Those aren't allowed in the city." The big man stopped in front of him and reached up with his free hand. After struggling for a bit, he got one, then the other shoulder plate unbuckled, letting them fall to the stones. "Leos, please! Something very bad is about to happen, and it'll be pretty hard for me to stop it if you kill me." Leos unclasped his breastplate. It dropped with a clatter, leaving him with only his rusted ringmail shirt. He took the sword in both hands. "This has to end now, Fraenk. I'm sorry." Fraenk pinched his eyes shut. If he was going to get sliced in half, he didn't want that to be the last thing he saw. He heard the faint swish of the metal links of the chain shirt move. This was it. Without thinking, Fraenk just began to speak. "Leos! Leos! Wait. Don't do this. I forgive you. What happened when we were kids doesn't matter now. You can't change it. You can only change what you do now. And if you kill me, I can't stop Brimblade and Dandrican from bringing a very large monster into the city." There was a pause. Fraenk cracked an eye open, and was surprised to see Leos was not poised with the sword raised above him. He had the hilt sitting on the ground, and the point of the blade under his chainmail shirt, the sword tip pointed right at his heart. "I'm sorry, Fraenk, for everything." Tears were in his eyes, and the small, hateful black worms were spilling out from his mouth. "I don't want to hurt anyone else. Dandrican is at the docks, Pier 4. Go stop him." Fraenk screamed and tried to grab the blade, but it was too late. Leos Moninger leaned forward with all his weight. He groaned as the sword cut all the way through him and came splitting out through the mail on his back. He collapsed sideways and watched Fraenk for a few more moments before the shine left his eyes. Falling backward onto his seat, Fraenk unleashed an anguished wail. Everything around him was collapsing and turning to darkness. Despair threatened to engulf him. This necklace was a magical force of pure destruction. He could see why Brightrock wanted it gone. He sat there for a moment in the silent darkness, wishing he had a bottle of something with which to numb himself.
"Neversleep, why are you sitting there?"
Fraenk could hear the voice of the arch-partisan now, calling to him from beyond, just like Mycon had done. Perhaps he was bringing sage wisdom from the realm of light.
"Neversleep, you crook. Get up or Grom strike you by the powers."
The voice was loud, and had an unusual amount of swears from someone in the beyond. Then Fraenk saw the old elf's hand raise. By some gift of mercy, Brightrock was still alive. In an instant, Fraenk was up, scrambling over to Brightrock. He looked at the wound, unsure of what he could do. "Sir, hang on! We'll get you to the temple healers." Brightrock grabbed Frank's shirt with surprising strength.
"Don't worry about me. Get down there and stop them."
"But—" Fraenk tried to protest.
"Neversleep, really listen to me this time. If you let those skarks summon a nether demon into this city, I'll kill you myself, probably with this spear."
"Yes, sir," Fraenk acknowledged.
"Take my horse and go, and powers give you strength,"
Olwyn Brightrock said. Fraenk ran to the only horse who hadn't fled the carnage, a steely-spined stallion who seemed to have taken on the disposition of the arch-partisan himself. He took one last look at Brightrock, who pointed to the spear shaft, then to Frank's head.
Do not fail.
Was the last thing Fraenk heard the elf say, before he spurred the horse on, and they rang mighty galloping hoofbeats through the otherwise dark and quiet streets of Arathes. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.